Well, tonight's topic is titled The Truth About the Future. And that is something I think everybody would like to know. Because many people make predictions, and which one of them, or if any of them, are actually correct. So tonight's topic, The Truth About the Future, is one that is very important. And our story begins way back in the year 605 BC. And it is taken from a book in the Bible titled Daniel. So it's written by Daniel from his perspective, and in the year 605 BC, King Nebuchadnezzar of Babylon had surrounded the city of Jerusalem and had taken it, and Daniel and some of his friends had been taken as captives to Babylon. Now, through a series of amazing events, Daniel he finds himself, after 3 years of re-education in the University of Babylon, he finds himself as one of the king's wise men, an advisor to the king. In fact, the smartest of the wise men and an advisor to the king. And our story begins in Daniel chapter 2 with something that I'm sure you're all very familiar with, and that is a bad dream. I don't know about you, but certainly I have had bad dreams before, and sometimes, you wake up in the morning and you think to yourself, man, I had a really bad night's sleep last night, and you think, what was it about? And maybe you can remember some things. Sometimes you can't remember anything, and you're wondering, what was it that was so bad? I know I had a bad night's sleep. And this is exactly what happened to King Nebuchadnezzar. Daniel chapter 2. We're going to read a lot from Daniel today in chapter 2. And I want you to read along with me if you can, because I want you to see that the story I'm telling you is not one that I've made up. It's one straight out of the Bible, and is a remarkable story that evidences God's power. Daniel chapter 2 and verses 1 to 3. Let's begin reading in verse 1. And in the second year of the reign of Nebuchadnezzar, Nebuchadnezzar dreamed dreams, wherewith his spirit was troubled, and his sleep brake from him. Then the king commanded to call the magicians and the astrologers and the sorcerers and the Chaldeans for to show the king his dreams. So they came in, and they stood before the king. And the king said unto them, I have dreamed a dream, and my spirit was troubled to know the dream. So you can see what's happened here, can't you? Nebuchadnezzar has had a bad dream, and he's calling in the people that ought to be able to help him. These are the people who can see into the future, supposedly, who have connections with the gods, and who are able to help King Nebuchadnezzar to understand what has gone wrong in his sleep. Now, verse 4. Then spoke the Chaldeans to the king in Syriac. O king, live forever. Tell thy servants the dream, and we will show you the interpretation. Does that sound reasonable enough? Is that what you would expect if you went? If you had it in your mind that you were going to go to an astrologer or a fortune teller, you would tell them what you had dreamt, and they would tell you what it meant. Well, it takes a wee turn here, because in verse 5, the king answers and says to the Chaldeans, The thing is gone from me. If you will not make known unto me the dream, with the interpretation thereof, ye shall be cut into pieces, and your houses shall be made a dunghill. But if you show the dream and the interpretation thereof, ye shall receive of me gifts and rewards and great honour. Therefore show me the dream and the interpretation thereof. Well, what a spot to be in. The king doesn't just want to know what his dream means. He actually wants to know what the dream was. Now, that's a difficult situation to be in, isn't it? Sometimes I've woken up in the morning, I've had a bad dream, and I've said to my wife, wow, you won't believe what I dreamt last night. It was terrible. And I'll tell her, and then she'll say to me, oh, don't worry, Tim, it was all a dream. But when you wake up in the morning and you're grumpy for no reason, and you don't know what it was that you dreamt, nobody knows what to tell you. And these people who are supposed to be connected to the supernatural haven't got a clue. And they reply to the king and say in verse 10, the Chaldeans answered and said to him, there is not a man on earth that can show the king's matter. Therefore there is no king, lord, nor ruler that ever asked any such things of a magician or astrologer or Chaldean. And it's a rare thing that the king requires. And there's none other that can show it before the king except who? Except the gods whose dwelling is not with flesh. What are they saying here? Listen, king, I'm sorry that you're angry. And if you'll just show us the dream, we'll tell you what it means. But there's no one, they say, no one that can tell you what you are thinking, what you thought in your dream. There's no one that can read your mind to tell you what you were thinking. Now, I know that there are people who say that they can read your mind, and I think a lot of it's pretty good guesswork, because you might know what someone is likely to do based on your knowledge of them, and you may have an idea of what someone is thinking because of what they've said to you in the past. But to be actually able to sit there and read somebody's mind without them expressing anything about what they're thinking is impossible. And even the soothsayers and the magicians and the astrologers and all the other people that claim they can read your mind, here we have evidence in the Bible where they admit that they cannot do it. That nobody can read the mind, can read the thoughts of the heart except God. And as they say here, there is none other that can show it before the king except the gods whose dwelling is not with flesh. In other words, the only way that we can find out what your dream really was, what you were thinking, what you were feeling, is if God tells us, and God's not telling us. They admit that only God can read the thoughts. Daniel chapter 2 and verse 12 says that for this cause the king was very angry and very furious, and he commanded to destroy all the wise men of Babylon. You can imagine how disappointed he was. Because here he has these men who occupy high positions in his government, men who he pays a lot of money, who live lavishly at his expense, who are there to help him when he has these kinds of problems. And they claim that they can help him. They claim that they have connections to the supernatural. But at the very moment he needs them the most, they let him down. You know, this is the problem, isn't it? There are some people who claim that they can tell the future, that they can read your thoughts and all this kind of thing, that they're connected to the supernatural, and people pay a lot of money to go and see them. And sometimes they get things close, and a whole lot of times they get things very wrong. I mean, have you ever read Nostradamus? You know, I've read a little bit of Nostradamus, and I tell you what, it's so vague. It's more vague than some of us find Shakespeare. The truth is, something that is only right some of the time, something that can be interpreted to mean whatever you want, is not a very reliable source of information. And yet these people, talking to the king, claimed that they had a connection to the gods. And the one time he needed them, they let him down. Maybe you've had a similar experience. And this king who felt so duped, so betrayed by these charlatans, said to himself, well, if you really can't tell me anything about what I'm thinking and feeling, if you really don't have a connection to the gods, if the gods are not talking to you in a way that's helpful to anyone else, then why do I need you? You might as well be destroyed. And that's exactly what he ordered. That they destroy all the wise men of Babylon. Now here we have a problem. Because Daniel and some of his friends also occupied the position of wise men in the kingdom of Nebuchadnezzar. And for some reason, we're not told why, Daniel and his friends were not present when the king demanded that he be told his dream and the meaning of it. And I have good reason to believe that Daniel was a little bit different to the other wise men of Babylon. That he caucused with his friends who believed the same things as he did. They had connection to a different God. And so he's not here, but later on, the captain of the king's guard comes to arrest him because he is one of the wise men, and the king has commanded in his fury that all the wise men of Babylon are destroyed. So, fortunately for Daniel, he has a good reputation. He's not like some of the other show ponies at the court. And he says to the king's guard, he says, "Why is it so hasty from the king? Can you please ask a little bit of time from the king so that I can ask the God of heaven to help us?" And so the king, who regards Daniel highly and obviously wasn't thinking of him when in his anger he ordered all the wise men to be destroyed, he grants a little bit more time. So Daniel and his friends go home and they pray. They ask the God who wrote the Bible, who authored the Bible, who inspired the Bible, to give them an understanding of what the king is after. And would you believe it? That night, Daniel has a dream. In fact, he has exactly the same dream that Nebuchadnezzar had the night before. He wakes up in the morning and he says this, Daniel chapter 2 and verse 23 and 24, "I thank thee and praise thee, O God of my fathers, who has given me wisdom and might, and has made known unto me now what we desired of thee. For thou hast made known unto us the king's matter." And so Daniel goes in before Arioch, the captain of the guard, whom the king had ordained to destroy all the wise men of Babylon. He goes in and says to him, "Destroy not the wise men of Babylon. Bring me in before the king, and I will show unto the king the interpretation." It's a remarkable thing, isn't it? God tells Daniel the very dream that even the king didn't know he had the night before. Something supernatural is going on. And it's something that the other wise men in Babylon, the magicians and the astrologers and all the rest of it, who claim to read the signs, cannot do. They cannot read the thoughts of the king's heart. Even the king who had the dream had it taken away so he couldn't remember it. Now, remember I said to you before, how do we know that it is God speaking? How do you prove that you are you? Well, you can show some ID, because only you would have that ID. But often when you ring a bank or a lawyer's office or an accountant or a government department, they ask you for information that only you know. And so God here is giving us a message tonight. Just as he was giving Daniel and the king and the wise men in Babylon a message in 605 or sometime after that BC. He's identifying himself and he is saying, "I am the God of heaven because I can tell you things that you don't know. I can tell you things that only I know. And if only God knows them, then it must be God talking." Remember what the wise men said to the king? They said, "There is none," this is in verse 11, "there is none that can show it before the king except the gods, whose dwelling place is not with flesh." So the wise men set the test. They said to the king, the only person who can tell you what you dreamed is God. And so we know now that it is God who is talking through Daniel, because God has revealed the king's dream to Daniel, something that nobody else could know. He's passed the identification test, hasn't he? He's identified himself. And now we can believe that what we are hearing is coming from God. So Daniel comes in before the king in verse 27. He says, "The secret which the king has demanded," he reminds him, "cannot the wise men, the astrologers, the magicians, the soothsayers show unto the king. But there is a God in heaven that reveals secrets and maketh known unto the king Nebuchadnezzar what shall be in the latter days. And so here we have another identifying mark of the real God, the true God. Another identifying feature that says this is God that is talking. We've had the first one. Only God can read the thoughts of the heart of man. Nobody else can read your mind. And now the second one, Daniel says, he's come to make known to the king Nebuchadnezzar what shall be in the latter days. In other words, God is making known to you, King Nebuchadnezzar, what is going to happen in the future. Only God knows the future. John chapter 14 and verse 29, Jesus said, "And now I have told you before it come to pass, so that when it comes to pass, you might believe." In other words, I'm going to tell you what's going to happen tomorrow. And when it happens, you'll know that I'm God. I mean, you admit it. If I told you tonight that you're going to go home from here, and when you get home tonight, there's going to be an earthquake, and in the earthquake, your house is going to fall down, but you'll be okay, and that under the rubble, when they clear some of the rubble from your house, they're going to find a container, and in it is $5 million. Imagine if you go home tonight, there's an earthquake, and your house falls down, and they find a container with $5 million in the rubble. I guarantee you'll all be asking for my phone number. Because there's nobody who could know that there was going to be an earthquake and that they would find $5 million in your house. We ought to want to know what God has to say. Because He says He can tell you before it comes to pass, and when it comes to pass, then we can believe that He knows the future, that He is God. Listen to this, Isaiah 46 verse 9 and 10. He says, "Remember the former things of old, for I am God and there is none else." In other words, He's saying, I am the only one who can do this. There is no one like me. The fortune tellers, the magicians, the astrologers, the wise men, they're not like me. And here's the difference, He says. "Declaring the end from the beginning, and from ancient times the things not yet done." So the identifying feature of God, the identifying mark, the thing that tells us that it is really God, is that A, He can read your thoughts. Nobody else can really do that. And B, He can tell the future with unerring accuracy. So we're not talking here about 50% of the time or 20% of the time, or sometimes He gets it right. He says, I know the future 100% of the time. That is how you can know that I am God. Well, nobody but God knew what the king had dreamed. And the dream, he says, is about what's going to happen in the future. So Daniel stands before the king and he says to him in verse 31, "Thou, O king, sawest, and behold, a great image. The great image, whose brightness was excellent, stood before thee, and the form thereof was terrible." This was a nightmare. Remember, this is a king who has not been afraid in battle, who's gone on to conquer the Assyrians and the Egyptians and many others. And if he had been fearful, he would not have conquered. But now in his dream, he sees something terrible. And it comes back to King Nebuchadnezzar's mind as Daniel is speaking. He's asleep on his bed and there's a great image. Have you ever been afraid in bed at night as a kid? And you don't want to put your leg out of the bed because you're worried there's something under the bed that might grab it? Some of the kids know what I'm talking about. And then you're worried there's something up there that's going to get you, so you pull the covers over your head. Well, kids, I know what you're talking about. Some of us men remember what it was like to be a kid. Well, this King Nebuchadnezzar was never afraid of much. But here in his dream, he sees something terrible. And it's standing over his bed. a great image. And this is what it looked like. In verse 32, the image's head was of fine gold. His breast and arms were of silver. His belly and thighs of brass. His legs of iron. His feet part of iron and part of clay. And now Daniel says, when you saw this image, something very strange then happened. Towering above you, this great colossal thing made of metal. Well, mostly. Verse 34 says, thou sawest till that a stone was cut out without hands. That's the Bible's way of saying it was created supernaturally. It wasn't done by humans. It was done without hands. A stone that was cut out without human devising. A stone came that was cut out without hands and smote the image upon its feet, the feet that were of iron and clay, and brake them to pieces. Then was the iron, the clay, the brass, the silver, and the gold broken to pieces together and became like the chaff of the summer threshing floors, like grass blowing in the wind. And the wind carried them away, that no place was found for them, and the stone that smote the image became a great mountain and filled the whole earth. Verse 36, this is the dream. And now we will tell the interpretation thereof to the king. What an incredible experience. Can you imagine the look on Nebuchadnezzar's face? Nobody in the whole kingdom, none of the people that claimed they were religious, who talked to God, who prayed and offered their offerings and their sacrifices, none of them could tell him what he was thinking. But there's a God, Daniel's God, who has been able to read the thoughts of his heart and now promises to be able to tell him the future. For once, I believe that king was spellbound, entranced by a Hebrew captive that had a God that could do something that nobody else's God could do. The interpretation begins in verse 38. Daniel said to Nebuchadnezzar, thou art this head of gold. In other words, Nebuchadnezzar's kingdom was represented by the head made of gold. And that's why they refer to Babylon as the Golden Kingdom. It was truly spectacular. Many of you will have heard of the Hanging Gardens of Babylon, one of the 7 wonders of the ancient world. According to the record of Josephus, the Hanging Gardens of Babylon were built by the king for his wife. Apparently she missed her homeland, and in order to make her feel more at home, he built this colossal structure upon which plants were planted at different levels and different humidities and so forth, in order to recreate something like her homeland. That it was one of the things that Babylon had in it, but there were many marvelous things. And if you ever go to the museum, the British Museum, you'll see evidence of the Kingdom of Babylon. And of course, there is the museum in Germany that has the tiles from the gates, the blue tiles, a fascinating kingdom. And we know it today is Iraq, but Babylon back then was not like Iraq today. In fact, Iraq is nothing like Babylon was. It might surprise you to know that Babylon probably should never have become a kingdom. But through a series of reverses that occurred to the Egyptians and to the Assyrians, all of a sudden we find Babylon a rising power and then the superpower of that time. In fact, the most splendid kingdom that the Bible says has ever existed was the Babylonian kingdom. Truly a head of gold. Well, despite its grandeur, it wouldn't last forever. And here's an interesting thing. Notice Daniel chapter 2 and verse 39. It says there that after the Babylonian kingdom came to an end, another kingdom would arise, but this kingdom would be inferior to Babylon. Now, isn't that strange? Wouldn't you think that a more superior kingdom would invade Babylon and take over. But according to the Bible, and here's another indication, God says it's not going to be how you think it should be, it's going to be how I've said, because I can tell the future. And in the future, a kingdom which is not as glorious as the Babylonian kingdom is going to conquer Babylon. History tells us that the kingdom that followed the Babylonians was the Medo-Persians. And the Medo-Persians were, as the name suggests, an amalgamation of two kingdoms, the Median kingdom and the Persian kingdom. And they got together, and under the command of Cyrus, Cyrus was the one to conquer Babylon. Now, this is an interesting story because at the time when Cyrus conquered Babylon, Babylon was considered to be impregnable. It was unconquerable. It had massive thick walls. And in those days, what they used to do, in fact this happened for many centuries, is they would send their armies to surround the city, and they would put in place a siege. And during that siege, nobody could get in or out, and that means no food or water could get in and out. And so after they had done this for a long time, the people in the city would eventually start to suffer from disease, from famine, and they would put pressure on their king, a little bit like we have sanctions today on different countries where they can't trade. And the idea, or the reason behind this, the purpose of it, is to put pressure on the government to surrender. Well, Cyrus's army came and they besieged Babylon. Except Babylon wasn't worried. In fact, the man in charge, Belshazzar, he said, "Oh, the Medo-Persians are here. Never mind. Instead of sending out your soldiers to try and ward them off or attack them or something like this, he says, let's have a party. Let's have a party." Wow. What gave him the confidence to do that? Well, as I said, Babylon's walls were so thick, it was considered that they could never be breached. Babylon also had a source of water. The Euphrates River ran right through Babylon. And so they weren't worried about the water supply. And inside the city of Babylon, there was so much food, so many provisions, that they would outlast the people outside the city, it was thought, because they had so much food available to them. So how were they to be conquered? Well, Belshazzar is inside having a feast, getting drunk, with all his lords and ladies having a big party. Cyrus has hatched a plan. And the plan involved diverting the river Euphrates and then sending his army in where the river was, on the dry riverbed, into the city. Now, of course, it was an ingenious plan, except the designers of Babylon had actually already thought of this. And so what they had done is they had gated the river, so that if anyone ever got under the gates of the river and managed to do something to get through there, then they would still have to get through the brass gates on the banks of the river before they could get into the inner city. Well, on the night that Cyrus's army attacked, with the Babylonians drunk inside, they strangely enough found the gates from the river into the inner city open. And you think, well, that's just a matter of chance. Yeah, I guess God said that the Medo-Persians would attack Babylon and overcome it. But boy, that was lucky, wasn't it? Finding the gates open. Except for one thing that the Bible says. Let's read it. Isaiah chapter 45 and verse 1. "Thus saith the Lord to his anointed, to Cyrus, whose right hand I have holden, to subdue nations before him. And I will loose the loins of kings, to open before him the two-leaved gates, and the gates shall not be shut." This is written by the prophet Isaiah before Cyrus was even in existence. So there are two miraculous things about this prophecy. The first is that God predicted that it would be a man named Cyrus who would attack Babylon and conquer it. But the second thing that's amazing is that God predicted that the means by which Cyrus would conquer Babylon would be that he would get in and find the gates open. And that is exactly what happened. Now, the miracles don't stop there, because do you know that Cyrus should not even have existed? There's a record, and it was recorded by a man named Herodotus. I have the book at home. He was a historian, a Greek historian, who lived in the 5th century BC. And he recounts the strange circumstances of Cyrus's birth. You see, the king of the Medians at that time, the Medes, was a king Astyages was his name. And Cyrus was his grandson. When Cyrus was born, Astyages looked at him and had a strange sort of feeling about him. And back in those days, kings were very aware of these strange impressions or feelings they got, and they listened to them. And he had this strange feeling when he looked at Cyrus, and he was worried that one day Cyrus would grow up and he would take over the Median kingdom, take it away from Astyages, and that he would rule in his place. And so Astyages did what a normal king would do in those days. He called his one of his helpers in, his soldiers, and he said to him, I want you to take that baby, take baby Cyrus, and dispose of him, kill him. So that's what the man did. He took the baby, he took him out, and he was about to kill him, but he started to feel a little bit uneasy about it. He didn't really feel comfortable to do it. Something moved upon his heart to not want to do what was probably quite normal for a man in his position. And as he was thinking about what he was going to do, he came across a farmer, a peasant. And this peasant had a wife, and the wife had just given birth, and the baby had died, and they were both very upset. Well, you can probably guess what happened. The king's servant took Cyrus, gave him to the peasant and his wife, took the dead baby and handed it back to the king and said, the job is done, Cyrus is dead. Well, of course, Cyrus wasn't dead. Cyrus grew up, and Cyrus did take over the kingdom of the Medes. And together with the Persians, he came and fulfilled the prediction, the prophecy that God gave through Isaiah. Conquered Babylon, found the gates open. Exactly as God had said. You see, even the scheming of a king cannot reverse what God has said will happen. Remember, it is an identifying mark that it is God talking, because God knows what is going to happen in the future. And if God says what's going to happen in the future, and it doesn't happen, then it mustn't be God talking. Because God says this is how you will know that it's me. Well, after the kingdom of the Medes and the Persians, Daniel chapter 2 and verse 39 tells us that a third kingdom of brass was to arise, which would bear rule over all the earth. And history tells us, and so does the book of Daniel in a couple of places, that the kingdom that would follow the Medo-Persians was none other than the Greeks. Many of you will have heard of Alexander the Great. And Alexander the Great conquered the Medo-Persian kingdom at the Battle of Arbela, sometimes referred to as the Battle of Gaugamela, in 331 BC, when Alexander the Great crushed the army of Darius. Now, there's an interesting thing that happened not long or not far away from when this happened. You see, according to Josephus, who was a Jewish historian, Alexander, who was fresh from conquering Gaza in November 332 BC, had come to Jerusalem. And he had come to Jerusalem with an evil intent in his heart. You see, when he was at battle, he had asked the Jews to send reinforcements. And the Jews, thinking to themselves, well, you know, Darius is the king, we don't want to annoy him, and, you know, if we go against him and he wins, then we're going to get punished. So they backed, strangely enough, even though they had this prophecy in front of them from Daniel, they backed Darius. And they didn't send reinforcements to help Alexander. Well, as it turns out, Alexander won. No thanks to the lack of help from the Jews. And so when he came to Jerusalem, he came to dish out some serious punishment. Well, when he got to Jerusalem, Josephus records that this prophecy that I'm sharing with you tonight, together with another prophecy that directly refers to the Greeks, and in fact to Alexander the Great, they showed these prophecies to Alexander. And when Alexander saw that the God of the Jews had predicted that he and his army would conquer the Medo-Persians, he was so impressed that there was a real oracle, a real God among the Jews that had predicted his rise. Instead of punishing them, he decided to hand out favors. Isn't that good? A lucky escape for the Jews, but only because their God knew the future. If only they had listened to it and backed the right team, things might have been different. They might have got more favor from Alexander. Well, even Alexander's kingdom was not to last forever. Daniel chapter 2 and verse 40 says that a fourth kingdom shall arise that shall be as strong as iron. For as much as iron breaketh into pieces and subdues all things, and as iron breaketh all these, shall it break in pieces and bruise. What kingdom was known as the Iron Kingdom? And I don't mean the TV show. The Iron Kingdom was the kingdom of Rome. In fact, it wasn't so much a kingdom. It became more like a kingdom later on. But Rome was known as by its association with iron. And by 168 BC, Rome's influence in Greece was growing. And eventually the Macedon army came to battle with the Romans at the Battle of Pydna. And this marked a turning point from Greek control to Roman control. 168 BC. Rome. Who would have guessed? Well, the answer is nobody would have guessed. It would have been impossible to guess when this prophecy was given to Daniel about 600 and something something BC. It would be impossible to guess that in 168 BC, a kingdom known as Rome would beat the Greeks to take over. It was impossible. Because way back then, when this prophecy was given, Rome barely existed. It would be like saying that one day in 300 years, Stewart Island will conquer the United States of America and rule the world. I know, some of you are probably glad about that, but it's impossible, isn't it? Such an unlikely prediction. In fact, a stupid prediction to human minds. But God predicted more than 400 years before it happened that Rome, a little city-state, would one day rule the known world, the Iron Kingdom. And of course, most of you have heard of Rome. I'm told that men think about the Roman Empire so many times per day. I don't know if that's true. It's certainly not true for me, but it is certainly something that men think about. And even with Rome, the Bible said that something would happen that would cause it to change. Let's read it together, Daniel chapter 2 and verse 41. And whereas thou sawest the feet and toes, part of potter's clay and part of iron, the kingdom shall be divided. But there shall be in it the strength of the iron, for as much thou sawest the iron mixed with the miry clay. Verse 42. And as the toes of the feet were part of iron and part of clay, so the kingdom shall be partly strong and partly broken. And whereas thou saw iron mixed with miry clay, they shall mingle themselves together with the seed of men, but they shall not cleave one to another, even as iron is not mixed with clay. So you see, you have this great image, a head of gold, a chest and arms of silver, belly of brass, legs of iron, and feet made of iron and clay. So the legs of iron symbolize the Empire of Rome. But then the Empire of Rome was going to change when it came to the feet. Instead of just being iron, it was going to be iron mixed together with clay. Now, I know some of you will have done metal work at school. Some of you have worked with metal. When was the last time you did some metal work, and in order to make what you were going to make, you mixed some clay in it to complete the product? You don't do that? You don't mix clay with iron to make a stainless steel bench or to make a tool? Of course you don't. And that's what's so strange about what happens to the Roman Empire. It became a great empire. But then, all of a sudden, something about it changes. And something mixes itself together with the Roman Empire that should not be there. Now, I've told you before about a man named Constantine. And what Constantine did was rather a unique experience. Because up until then, they were persecuting Christians in the Roman Empire. But all of a sudden, Constantine turns up. And Constantine claims that he is now a Christian. He claims he saw something in the sky. It wasn't something in the sky that made him get down on his knees and repent of his sins. It made him live a different life, a life of peace and harmony with other people. Instead, he saw something in the sky that said to him, it was a cross, he claims, that said to him, "In this sign you will conquer." In other words, it was a military kingdom still. And so he got his army and he marched them through the river Tiber, and he said, "Congratulations, even though you're pagans and you behave like pagans and you live like pagans, you're now officially Christians, you're baptized." That tells you something about the kind of Christian that Constantine was. And from then on, the Romans took their gods and they renamed them as Christian apostles. They took their ceremonies, their pagan ceremonies, and they renamed them as Christian ceremonies. Not ones found in the Bible, mind you. They just renamed them after Christian events, like the crucifixion and the birth of Christ, the day of the sun. And suddenly paganism and Christianity kind of merged. The pagan Roman state mixed with the Christian religion came up with a sort of Christian religion, a Christian state that had part of the Bible truth mixed together with pagan errors. The Bible describes it like iron mixed with clay. It doesn't really go together, because the religion of the Bible is very different to the pagan religions of Rome. You can't mix them together. You try living like a Christian and living like a pagan Roman at the same time. It doesn't work. But that's what they did. Of course, that carried on since about the year 538, when this empire managed to take control of the Western Roman Empire, and it continues to this day. Many of the nations of Europe are still nominally Christian. But it's a funny mixture. It doesn't really work. The churches are empty pretty much when people have a choice about whether to go or not. But for the best part of 1,000 years, they had no choice, because the government controlled what they believed and what they thought. A Christianity that's enforced is not a real Christianity, because what I believe is about what's in my heart. not just the ceremonies I perform in public. And so Europe was divided. And those nations of Europe still exist today. But they don't get on very well, do they? We have what we call a European Union, which is not really that unified. You've all heard about Brexit, where the UK left the European Union. Nigel Farage. You've heard of Marine Le Pen, the French leader, or would-be leader. Mark Rutte from the Netherlands, the Alternative for Germany, Alternative for Deutschland in Germany. In Italy we have Giorgia Meloni, and in Hungary we have Viktor Orban. It's an unhappy marriage of nations, an unhappy union. Iron mixed with clay, church mixed with state. And it's just as Jesus said it would be. John chapter 14 and verse 29. And now I've told you before it come to pass, that when it come to pass, you might believe. Iron and clay. And you know, many people have tried to unite Europe. Charlemagne, Adolf Hitler, but they've all failed. It is still the divided European Union. God said in Isaiah 46 verse 9 and 10, remember the former things of old, for I am God. There is none else. I am God and there is none like me, declaring the end from the beginning, and from ancient times the things not yet done. But tonight I want to tell you that is not the main problem that the world faces. You see, this prophecy, this dream of the king, successfully predicted the nations of the world, the ruling empires from Babylon through Medo-Persia, Greece and Rome, the dividing of Rome into Europe as we know it today. But it didn't stop there. It hasn't finished yet, because all that does is take us to the present time. And of course everybody is wondering now, and it's what everybody is wanting to know, what's going to happen next? What is going to happen in the world after that? And this prophecy tells us. It tells us. Daniel chapter 2 and verses 44 and 45 tell us exactly what is coming. And just like Babylon was followed by Medo-Persia, which was followed by Greece, and followed by Rome, and followed by the breaking up of Rome, I have every reason to believe that God is going to be just as accurate with what is going to happen next as he has been with what has happened in the past. Don't you agree? Doesn't that stand to reason? Let's read it together. And in the days of these kings, verse 44, shall the God of heaven set up a kingdom which shall never be destroyed. And the kingdom shall not be left to other people, but it shall break in pieces and consume all these kingdoms, and it shall stand forever. Now this is interesting, because there are many Christians today who say that they want to set up a Christian kingdom again, a Christian government. And so in order to do that, they have to take over the government and to turn it into a Christian government. But the Bible predicts that the government that God is going to set up is not one that is made up of the powers that already exist. It is something that God is going to start from scratch. Let's read on. Verse 45, he says, for as much as thou sawest that the stone was cut out of the mountain without hands, in other words, without human involvement, it's a divine act, and that it break in pieces the iron, the brass, the clay, and the silver, and the gold, the great God hath made known to the king what shall come to pass hereafter. The dream is certain, and the interpretation thereof sure. What is this rock? What is this rock that comes from outer space without hands and breaks into pieces all the kingdoms of this world, destroys them? They're blown away like cut grass in the wind. And instead turns into a mountain and becomes the kingdom of God. It is none other than the second coming of Jesus, the return of Jesus to this earth. Now that might sound fantastic to some of you. Fantastic in the sense you're looking forward to it, or perhaps fantastic in the sense that you say to yourself, well, that'll never happen. There's plenty of people who might agree with you. But I have to say that even if you don't have faith in God, if you're a man who studied the odds, if you watch the horses to see who wins, if you watch the sports teams to see who wins, and you collated the odds of something happening, if you looked at the odds of this prophecy coming true based on what has happened already in the past, you would have to say it's dead certain. Because everything else has happened against the odds, just as God predicted, has it not? The Bible tells us in Revelation chapter 11 and verse 15 that the kingdoms of this world are become the kingdoms of our Lord and of his Christ, and he shall reign forever and ever. Daniel chapter 2 and verse 47, the king answered unto Daniel. The pagan King Nebuchadnezzar answered unto Daniel, and he said, of a truth it is that your God is a God of gods, and a Lord of kings, and a revealer of secrets, seeing thou couldest reveal this secret. None of the other gods could tell the future. None of the other gods could read the heart and mind of that pagan king. But the pagan king is led to realize that the God of Daniel, the God of the Bible, the God that can predict the future, has read his thoughts and his heart and understands what is going to happen. Friends, this prophecy tells us that this world, as it is not going to last very long. And there's two things we need to remember from the story that we have read tonight, and from the history that we have reviewed. The first is that God knows what is going to come, and he's told us. He's told us that he is coming back to this earth, and he's going to correct everything that is going on here. He's going to take it away, and he is going to set up a kingdom as it should be. It's going to be his kingdom, and it's going to last forever. That's the first thing. And so my question to you tonight on that first point is, are you ready for that to happen? If Jesus is really going to come back and he's going to destroy all the systems of this world, there's going to be no more New Zealand government, Australian government, US government. There's going to be no more system of policing and healthcare and all the rest of it. It's going to be God's system from now on. The rules are going to change. Are you ready for that? Are you ready to live in a kingdom that is run by Jesus, the way that Jesus describes in the Bible that he wants us to live and wanted us to live from the beginning? Are you ready for that? I hope so. The second thing that we need to remember from the story we've looked at tonight is that no matter what you have told others, no matter what others think of you, no matter what image you project to others, you may be like King Nebuchadnezzar, a proud man who's a conqueror, a tough guy. You may come across as someone who's confident about your life, confident about your circumstances, puts on a brave face. But the second thing this story reveals to us tonight is that God, and God alone, reads the thoughts of your heart and my heart. He knows my mind. He knows your mind. He knows what you're really thinking. He knows when you're worried. He knows when you're tempted to do wrong. He knows when you're under pressure. He knows when you're being treated badly. He knows when you are facing circumstances that seem impossible, that nobody else can help you with. All the people that you think you can turn to like those astrologers and soothsayers and magicians of Babylon. He knows when they let you down, just at the time you need them the most. And He understands. And He doesn't want to leave you there hanging, leave you there struggling with all of life's problems. If He cares about a pagan king enough to send Daniel, the most important man in the kingdom, to come and help him, don't you think God understands how you feel? And He's wanting to come and help you too? You may not be able to trust others. You may not be able to rely on others. But you can rely on a God who knows your heart and who knows your future. Isn't that wonderful? Isn't that good news? You know, when I was a lot younger than I am now, I remember struggling with the idea of what to do about God. I knew that there was a Bible. I knew that it said some things about the way that God wanted my life to be. But I had plans. Maybe I was a bit like Nebuchadnezzar, confident about what I wanted to do and you know, the things I wanted to see, the places I wanted to go, how I was going to build my fortune. I was going to get a girlfriend. All the things that a young 14-year-old thinks about, 15-year-old. And I didn't quite see how God could fit in. Because it seemed to me that God wanted something different to my life, and I would have to be a certain way, and that God wouldn't help me to get the things that I wanted. We were working at odds with each other. Maybe God wouldn't let me have the things that I wanted, and I was afraid He would interfere. And then I read something that someone wrote. They said, Tim, this is how I heard it in my mind, you're a young man, you want all these things. You've got to decide what education you're going to get, what career you're going to have, who you're going to marry, where you're going to live, what kind of house you're going to buy, how to save up for it, how to build that fortune you're wanting. How do you know what to do? It's a big world out there. It's a cruel world. It's a dangerous world in many respects. It's an unforgiving world. It's a world that doesn't really care about you. How are you going to do? What if you make the wrong choice? Plenty of people do that every day. They go out with the wrong person, or they marry the wrong person. They choose the wrong job and end up in a lot of trouble. They make the wrong investment and lose their money. How are you going to know how to live your life? Who's looking after you, Tim? And then they said, if God really does know what He says He knows, if He really knows the future, and if He really knows what's going on in your heart and mind, as He has proved in our story tonight, then wouldn't you be better off with having God with you when you make these decisions than messing it all up and trying to sort it out later? Wouldn't you rather have a God that knows everything and cares about you, involved in your life at the start, rather than messing it up? That made sense to my young mind. And tonight I want to encourage you. If you've been inspired by the story that we have looked at tonight, if God has spoken to your heart and has said to you, I know what you're thinking, I know what you're feeling, I know your future, and I can help you. If you're impressed with that tonight, I want to encourage you. In your quiet time, when you go home tonight, I want you to say to God, God, will you help me? Will you be involved in my life? I need some help. You know I do. Maybe a small thing, it may be a lot of big things. But God can help you. I know He's helped me. Will you bow your heads with me as I pray for you tonight? Our Father in heaven, we just want to thank you so much for the story that you have recorded in the Bible. More than 2,500 years ago. so that we can know that you are a God who knows the future, and a God who knows our thoughts and feelings and cares about them. Tonight, Lord, we open our hearts to you. We ask you to come in just like you helped that pagan King Nebuchadnezzar. Come into our lives and show us what you want us to do. Show us how you can help us with our future. Lord, you know that we've messed perhaps so many things up in our lives, things we should have done differently. Maybe we should have involved you earlier. But tonight, Lord, we want to make up for that time. We want to ask you to come into our hearts now and to help us. For we ask it in Jesus' name. Amen.